I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. As we close out 2025, a year that has undoubtedly been one of the most consequential in recent memory, the Earlylands team thought it would be appropriate to have a conversation that could shed light on a man, George Orwell, whose name has become an adjective that is an ever-increasing part of daily discourse. We are very fortunate to be joined in this endeavor by DJ Taylor, who is considered Orwell's leading biographer. Taylor published in 2023 Orwell: The New Life, which served as a major revision to his previous award-winning book, Orwell: The Life, which was released in 2003. The most recent book received wide critical praise, such as the Wall Street Journal noting that, quote, expertly told and subtle in judgment, The New Life will not be the last word in the ever-growing field of Orwelliana, but it will become its central monument, end quote. We are pleased to welcome DJ Taylor to Earlylands in Conversation. We are very fortunate today to have DJ Taylor with us, David Taylor. David, where are we catching you at for this interview?
You're catching me in the study of my house on the outskirts of Norwich in Norfolk, UK.
Let's jump straight into it, David. You know, you've written thousands of pages about Orwell. You probably know, or arguably know, of the man better than anyone else alive today. I know this is a question that probably causes you to roll your eyes, but give us a thumbnail portrait of Eric Blair / George Orwell for those who may only know him as the author of 1984, Animal Farm, a book they may have read when they're 15 or 16 years old and now hear the name Orwell a lot, but don't know a lot about the man behind the name.
Well, you're very kind. You're very flattering. In fact, the more I revisit Orwell after all this time, the less I find that I know about him. This is the thing, but you see that, as you know, the collected works extend to 20 hardback volumes, plus all the stuff that's been discovered since then. And it's an absolute cornucopia. It enables you to pronounce multiple interpretations, to look at stuff from all kinds of different angles. There are hundreds of specialists deedly at work. So as a generalist, as someone who spends his time synthesizing, as well as trying to do some new research, and I do all kinds of other things as well as write about Orwell. But I mean, in terms of the thumbnail sketch, I suppose you see, it's very easy to see quite a lot of the people who study Orwell start with 1984, which was published only 6 months before he died,
Okay.
and then kind of work backwards, so to speak, and look at his life in terms of all the building blocks they can discover that lead up, that aim, that aid to the construction of 1984. And
Right.
it's very interesting in a way to wonder what we would think about Orwell if he died, say, in a bomb blast in 1944 during the Second World War, before he'd written Animal Farm in 1984. And I think we would have regarded him in a completely different light. We would sort of focus on other aspects of his vast output. So I suppose if a thumbnail sketch would be a man who at quite an early stage in his life turned aside for the destiny that had been created for him, because in terms of his upbringing and education, he was a very conventional kind of English gentleman of the old school, I suppose. His father was a colonial civil
Right.
servant. So all was a very conventional upbringing, and then he decided in his mid-20s that he wanted to be a
Right.
writer, which meant repudiating most of his origins and most of his upbringing. So he exists for quite a long time outside what we'll call the conventional literary lifestyle of the 1930s, and very much kind of self-taught, and gropes his way in the 1930s to a kind of political awareness, largely, by going around the north of England and looking at
Right.
the conditions in what were known as the distressed areas, by fighting in the Spanish Civil War. So he's kind of reaching his accommodation with the politics of the mid-20th century through a very kind of different and circuitous route to most people. And this makes him, I suppose, a different kind of writer, and that he's much more kind of teaching himself to find out about things than, he didn't go to university, for example. He didn't hang
Right.
out until quite late on with contemporary writers in the way that many another writer of that age does. So in some ways, although on the one hand, he's a very conventional kind of person with a lot of very conventional views, apart from his political views. But in other ways, he's very unconventional and doesn't sort of fit into the standard career trajectories
Right.
of the mid-20th century. And that, to me, I suppose, makes him fascinating. To be scrupulously accurate in terms of, I mean, as you know, I'm not saying it's obviously the same in America. Class origins were and are very important in
Of
English
course.
life. And Orwell described himself with his characteristic precision as belonging to the lower upper middle classes.
Yeah, I love that. I thought that was very
By that,
English.
you see, by that he meant that most of the expertise he was supposed to possess, as a kind of birthright, was theoretical rather than practical. So
Right.
theoretically, he belonged to the social class, which had servants and dressed for dinner and shot and hunted and all this kind of thing and owned land. But in fact, his father was quite a minor colonial civil servant in the Indian civil service and didn't
Right.
know, retired on a pension of a few £100 a year. And so, the Blair family made do with I think a single daily help to come round. There were no sort of servants in the accepted
Right.
sense. And
Right.
certainly
But yet he
Orwell's, I think
did go to Eton and
he did go to
he
Eton, but
checked a
he
lot
went
of
to
the
Eton on a
boxes.
scholarship. He could not have afforded to go there had he not been very clever and won a scholarship to the place. So although he is part of the British establishment,
Right.
he's pretty much a petitioner at its door rather than a bona fide member. So his class background is quite fascinating.
And so you have spent decades writing about Orwell. Your first biography, well, it was 2000, 2001, I would say. It
2003.
2003, that's right. And then your most recent, which is essentially just a full rework, right? It's not just an updated edition. So what was it about Orwell that first seized your imagination to become, as you put it, this synthesizer of his works and his life? But what was it about Orwell initially that grabbed you?
Well, it's rather odd and rather kind of oblique, I suppose, because most people, certainly in the UK, most people in the UK, and I suppose elsewhere in the world, would come across Orwell through Animal Farm or
Right.
1984, which tend to be set books, on course lists. But in fact, when I was 12 or 13, my mother's very quite small collection of books in our family home contained a paperback copy of Orwell's second novel, Clergyman's Daughter, published in 1934. Now, even I, as an Orwell addict, would probably have to contend that it's not the greatest thing he ever wrote. It's about this woman living in Suffolk in the 1930s who loses her memory and then has all kinds of adventures around southeastern England and and ends up more or less back where she is on the final page. And yet, for some reason, that novel captured my imagination in a way that hardly
Interesting.
anything I'd read previously had. It was the first kind of grown-up novel I'd read, I suppose, rather than a children's book, and it completely captivated me. And what I always say about it is that my reaction to it was the same as Orwell's reaction that he describes when he first read Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer in the mid-1930s. And he says his reaction was that he wrote this for me, he knows all about me.
Oh,
So my
wonderful. So it
reaction was
truly
that
touched your soul, so to
it
speak.
did. There was one. So my reaction at the age of 12 or 13, there is one copy of this book in the world. It was written for me, and I found it on my mother's bookshelf. And
I
after
love it.
that, I wanted to find out about all the other stuff. And so, as
That
well as reading, obviously one had read, Animal Farm at school in 1984. But in fact, the thing that really fascinated me was in those days, if you wanted to read Orwell in the round, which is to say, to read his journalism and his essays, as well as his full length works. In those days, there was 4 volumes in a Penguin edition of his collected journalism, essays, and letters, and these were substantial volumes. They were 500-page paperbacks, and in those days they were very, very cheap. And so, from the age of about 15 or 16, I was buying volumes of those. And reading his essays and reading his reviews of quite minor books, simply to get a flavour of what he wrote
right.
about, and how wonderful it all was.
And do you still have those dog-eared penguins,
I
I
do.
hope?
I mean, they're falling to bits, and of course, they've been superseded by Peter
Sure.
Davison's wonderful 20-volume collected edition. But I still have my old Penguin paperbacks. Yes.
Fantastic. Love that. I love that. Well, then how has for someone who truly has, since you were 12 or 13 years old,
Mm.
Orwell has been at the core of your professional, of course, but also it sounds like your personal intellectual journey. How has his perception changed over the years, right? I mean, you've lived with him for so long, read so much about him.
I
You know,
suppose
uh,
my perception of him has changed, and the reason that I suppose this is all tied up with the reason for writing the second book, which, as you correctly diagnose is not simply a reworking of the first one. I started again from scratch and, as if I was beginning anew, despite having all the ulterior knowledge to which you refer. And I was very fortunate because incrementally there is this steady drip of new material come sort of arrives. And 6, 7 years ago, I was very fortunate to be put in the way of two collections of lost Orwell letters, which he'd written to two of his Suffolk girlfriends, Eleanor Jakes and Brenda Salkeld, in the 1930s. And they were quite fascinating because they were fascinating not only in the fact that they simply enabled the biographer to fill in gaps in one's knowledge of where he
Right.
was and what he was doing at particular times. Because a lot of Orwell's life in the early 1930s is pretty, pretty misty, pretty shadowy, pretty difficult to reconfigure. So there was that aspect of it, simply knowing where he was and what he was doing. But reading, and there were about, I suppose, 50 new letters to Eleanor and
Wow.
Brenda. And it told me quite a bit about, certainly it told me a lot about his attitude to women. And I realized what I think I hadn't appreciated properly before, that once Orwell got a woman into his head, he couldn't let her out of it again. And so, for example, he proposed marriage to both of these women, and both of them turned him down. And yet, he's always he keeps in touch with them. I mean, his last communication with Brenda it's a letter written when he was actually sort of in hospital and almost ready to die in 1949. So he's constantly, sort of trying to renewing these old friendships, keeping in
Right.
touch with people, brooding about them, and I suppose it confirmed certain suspicions I had about his personality, and then led me into sort of new thoroughfares as well. I ended up, unfortunately, I ended up liking him just as much as I had previously.
Great.
I mean, the fatal thing, this does happen to some biographers, as I'm sure you know, is that you fall badly out of love with your subject halfway through the book, and then you still have to
Right.
finish
Right.
writing the
The
book.
sheen comes off of them, right? As you dig
That's
into
right.
personal
Now, I
letters.
mean, and obviously, I've come across all kinds of, there are many things about Orwell which it could be argued place him in an unfavorable light, but they are all explicable and they're all, to me, understandable in the context of his personality and the age he lived in. And I've never, I've always been able to find explanations for things, and so the luster has really never come off him for me,
Right.
which
Right.
is a relief, really, in the
Yeah.
circumstances.
But he was a man. I mean, this is an overused phrase, but he was a man of his time, right? So some of his views and beliefs would not have such resonance today in terms of his approach to women, or is that an overstatement?
Well, his obviously quite rightly too. I mean, Orwell's relationships with and attitudes to women have been very much discussed recently by women as well, which is a good
Right.
thing because I'd be the first person to concede that for a long time Orwell's studies was pretty much a boys' club.
Right.
And all the major biographies of him have been written by men. And his certainly his relationships with his first wife Eileen badly needed some kind of exploration, and books have been written. But one of the problems, I suppose, about his dealings with women until recently, so very little has been known. You see that the thing about Eileen,
Right.
his first wife, was until after I'd written my first book, in fact, there were virtually no manuscript sources at all. She was such a
Mm.
self-effacing woman. There was a bare handful of letters, and it wasn't until the 2000s when a very small cache of letters that she'd written to a very good friend of hers, a woman called Nora Miles, became available. We began to realize just how extraordinarily and vivid and fascinating her personality is.
Mhm.
So the reason, the male biographers, sometimes get accused of neglecting Eileen, but in fact, the reason she was so neglected for so long was it was just very, very difficult to find out anything
Right.
about her, you see. So I'm extremely keen on people, especially women, writing about Orwell's relations with women. But the reason it's been a grey area for so long is there was so little information.
Right. Right, exactly. So you've written vividly about the formative experiences that shaped him. I'm thinking, talking about Eileen, I'm thinking about just, homage to Catalonia and some of their scenes, experiences together.
Mm.
Um, but those formative experiences that shaped him, of course, the Spanish Civil War, his time in Burma, poverty in Paris and London. Which of those, or was it truly a mix? But which of those do you see as most decisive in forging the George Orwell that we all know?
I think I have to say, and I don't think I'd be alone in this, I'd have to say that it was Spain that was the most important thing because It's in Spain that we can see the roots of both Animal Farm and 1984. So the trajectory of the second half of his writing life is pretty much born of his experiences in Spain. It was in revolutionary
Right.
Barcelona in early 1937 that he kind of thought he'd come across, a properly egalitarian society that could be run on lines where people respected each other and people could, achieve some forms of personal satisfaction that weren't hierarchical, and so on and so forth. But it was also in Spain that he first, I mean, he'd had his suspicions. He always says that he had his suspicions of what was happening in Russia from about 1931 onwards, but it wasn't until he was personally affected by the Soviet Union's interference in the political lives of foreign states that he became aware, the malign uses to which propaganda could be put, the easiness with which totalitarian regimes collude in the denial of objective truth. All of these things he saw in Spain firsthand in 1937. And I think you can see the origins of the two major books in his Spanish experiences, which obviously had a terrific effect on him because he wrote several, as soon as he came back from Spain with a bullet wound through his throat from a fascist sniper, he immediately started work on Homage to Catalonia. He then wrote two long essays about Spain. He's always referring to Spain, reviewing books about Spain. I think, and Spain was, there were then sort of symbolic experiences,
Right.
professional experiences that grew out of his Spanish. His 6 months in Spain that I think that never left him. Having said which, Burma was very important to him because he was a servant of the colonial Raj. So in other words, he was dispensing authority rather than
Right.
being on the receiving end of it. And he thought that the situation in a British colony was pretty much it was an autocracy that he was serving. And so he certainly got an idea of power relations very close up at a very early age in the Far East.
If you read Orwell's writings about his time in Burma, right, there's such a sense of almost a schizophrenia, right, a recognition of the sort of emptiness of that life of a colonial middling servant, so to speak. And I think it kind of contributes to this idea of Orwell as a austere and very solitary guy, or, plugging away on his manuscript surrounded by cigarette smoke, or at least in my mind. But you also make a very compelling case that he could be humorous and sociable and tender. What do we miss when we reduce him to this sort of grim prophet of 1984 or Animal Farm?
There is, isn't there? There is this abiding air of, as you say, austerity. The art critic Michael Ayrton referred to him as Gloomy George. And in fact, I've just written, last month, I wrote a piece for the Times Literary Supplement based on a man called David Holbrook, who visited him on Jura in 1946. Holbrook was only in his early 20s, so Orwell was nearly twice his age. And Holbrook left what I think is the only kind of bad report of Orwell on Jura that anyone ever filed. He was a young man of 23, turned up, he was having a relationship with Orwell's the nanny who looked after Orwell's sons. Looked after Orwell's adopted son, and so Orwell, was sort of regarding him with a somewhat chary eye. But Holbrook, who admired Orwell's writings and had come to Jura prepared to admire Orwell, just thought that he was this terrible, gloomy old miserabilist who just gloomed around the place, having these terrible, these extremely tedious conversations with his sister Avril. And Holbrook was very, very unimpressed. But that's a fairly odd
Interesting.
reaction. I mean, his close friends thought that he was an extremely convivial and lively person, and he had a great capacity. He had a great sort of talent, I think, for friendship, but he could come across. I mean, I've read, that if there were occasions, but a lot of it in company. I think a lot of it was to do with the fact that his voice didn't carry,
Right.
because he'd been shot through the throat in Spain. It had affected his vocal cords, and eyewitnesses tend to say that if for example, he was at a dinner table with six people on it. He simply couldn't, if he couldn't make himself understood or heard, he would simply just kind of clam up and eat his food. And I think this may have led to this
So
slight
sort of the
reputation.
tall, quiet man at the corner then,
That's
right?
right. Yes, simply
Yeah,
because I think tete-a-tete, I think he was much better. But I think in crowds he just couldn't he couldn't be intelligible simply because of the fact that his voice was so sort of reedy and busted by that point.
for sure, for sure. Well, there's a question that we have to ask, right? That there's an Orwell industry today, and there's
Mm.
a sense that the phrase Orwellian has escaped the man, right? I think there's a lot of people who use it who may not actually be aware even where it came from. And, it's used almost every day in the contemporary political spectrum with a publishing industry to match. And what does that say about our contemporary relationship with Orwell? And then, of course, what do you make of the Orwell industry and the phrase Orwellian being a slur?
I think there are actually 2 or 3 questions in there,
Right.
Tom, so
That's
I'll
right.
just
That was
no,
a
which is
loaded,
great.
that
No,
was a heavy question
I'm
there.
not
So,
complaining, but I'll sort of unpick them a bit, if I may. To start at the beginning, yes, when I started work on Orwell, there was such a thing as Orwell studies. There were a few people who wrote about him, were
right.
interested. In the intervening 25 years, there is now a thing called the Orwell industry, which means, there are sort of dozens of academics at work, quite a lot of them in the States, more so than over here in the UK. There are scholarly publications. There has been an absolute torrent of books published
Right.
in the last 2 or 3 years. And what it means from the point of view of the generalist, the synthesis, which I described myself as previously, it means that every compartment of Orwell's life, and his life does tend to fall in, clearly demarcated compartments. Every compartment has 2 or 3 specialists hard at work. Whose presence in the area makes the general biographer feel somewhat intimidated. So there's that
Right.
aspect of it. As for Orwellian, you see, if somebody asked me to define Orwellian, I would say that it had to do with a kind of totalitarian society based on the denial of objective truth, the surveillance of its inhabitants, and tampering with language as well. Which is the heart of 1984. But Orwellian, as you say, I mean, I think it's used. Orwell himself has become what academics would call a floating signifier.
Right.
He's sort of
Right.
he's escaped from his original grounding like a hot air balloon and gone floating off across across the landscapes of the world, and he means virtually anything that anybody wants him to mean to anybody. And so if Republican senators, publishers decide they don't want to publish his book sometimes for quite proper and explicable reasons, it's Orwellian. It's and the number of times
Indeed.
it's used, as you say, it's misused in the way, even more so, it's misused in the way that Dickensian is misused. I mean,
Of
Dickensian
course.
has nothing to do with the novels of Charles Dickens these days. It's almost a kind of synonym. It just means, poverty or, poor conditions of a rather Victorian kind. So people would say, the street in which I lived was Dickensian. Whereas Dickensian used to have a more precise meaning than that, in the same way that Orwellian did. But there's nothing you can do about it, because people need these symbolic words to, the way that he's kind of colonized public discourse is quite inevitable, but it doesn't get us any closer to him as a writer.
Again, this is one of those questions that I'm sure causes you to roll your eyes. But in the world in which we live today, in which there are genuine fears about the safety and security of democratic institutions and just the general public conception of democracy
Yeah.
as a good that should be protected, what do you think he would make of the age in which we live? And again, you're trying to read the mind of a man you've never met.
That's right. I mean, the whole this question. I mean, the purport, the relevance of this question was brought home to me by Elon Musk's appearance by video screen at the demonstrations in the UK a couple of months ago, and I thought, and he was wearing a T-shirt that said, "What would Orwell think?" And I thought to myself, well, this is extraordinary, because here's the world's leading demagogue, sort of using the man who wrote most effectively about demagoguery to make some
Right.
kind of point. What would all have thought? I mean, I suppose I have to begin by saying, and you've already kind of hinted at this, that all speculations about dead people are meaningless, are profitless. They are profitless, but I suppose all we can say, you see, it's so difficult to predict what Orwell would have been interested in, and what he would have written about had he lived. Another point I always make, you see, is that he'd written the last 2 novels that he wrote, which are Animal Farm and 1984, dystopian novels, of imagined futures. But the novel that he was working on when he died, that he'd written a few pages of, was in fact going all the way back to the 1920s. It's a novel about, it was going to be a novel about a man coming back on the boat from Burma in 1927. So it's, in some ways, he's he's going back. He's reverting to type rather than
Right.
writing another dystopian novel. So it's interesting to wonder what. I mean, I think he would have. And there are friends of his, conservative friends of his would say that, oh, he would have got more traditional and he would have got more conventional the older he
Right.
got. But I think whatever, I think his radical conscience would still have been aflame, however old he got, and whatever the conditions of the world he was living in.
Right. Well, I guess it's probably the solipsism of the era that you live in that you think it's the most important. But I'm sure Orwell would have been equally shaken by the civil rights movement in the United States or the Vietnam War or threats of nuclear holocausts in the 70s and the 80s. All of those things would certainly have moved the man.
Oh, I think so. Oh, very much
Yeah.
so. Yes, I think he'd been very interested by the American civil rights movement because he so passionately believed in racial equality.
Right.
That would have been something he would have, I think, and
And
also.
that's it. That's often forgotten. Tell us a bit about that, because that is not associated with the man of 1984 and Animal Farm. So tell us, for a man who died not long after World War II,
Mm.
his views on racial equality.
Yes, I mean, Orwell was, I mean, despite having served in the Raj, where he was in charge of, as a young white man in charge of thousands of native Burmans, he was always, especially when he worked on in the BBC in the 1940s, when he worked on the BBC's Eastern Service as a talks producer, he went out of his way, to befriend and to employ Jamaicans and Indians, and
Right.
got on very well with them, and was always terribly upset if there was any suggestion that he was the pucker sahib, as we would say, meaning the using his kind of white authoritative English status to sort of domineer over these people. And I found in this collected letters, there's a very touching summary of a letter that was written to him by a Jamaican poet called Una Marson, who he knew and employed on the BBC in the 1940s. And it was clear that, that he meant a lot to her and that she regarded him as a kind of, as a friend and a guiding force when she was trying to establish herself as a writer. I think she was the first. I think she was the first black Jamaican ever to broadcast on British radio in the 1940s, and Orwell was substantially responsible for this. And he had many friends amongst the expatriate Indian community.
Right.
When he was working in London in the 1940s. And in fact, he once said that he so much enjoyed working on the Eastern Service and having these Indian colleagues. And it reminded him so much of being in the East that when he looked out of the window into Oxford Street in central London, he expected to see palm trees growing there.
Thinking about heirs to the Orwell sort of moral clarity of
Mm.
his writing and language. Are there other writers, columnists, etc.? I don't know. I'm thinking of the likes of A. Gill or Christopher Hitchens or others who you think are in some way, shape, or form embody a bit of what made Orwell so important? Or
Well,
was
I
he truly
suppose the
singular?
closest in recent decades, I would have to say that I would think the closest anyone came to him, and even that's not particularly close, would be Hitchens. To a certain extent, is his spiritual heir. But I suppose the distinction I would make that, and again, it's that old generalist, particularist distinction that involves myself. As Orwell wrote at a time, and he's been dead 75 years. He wrote at a time when it was easier for a single mind to get to grips with things. His range in terms of the books he was interested in and the political things that he wrote about, and his ability to fix on particular situations was that much wider, but also made that much easier by the lack of information. I suppose it's in some ways it was easier to be an Orwell in the 1940s than it is now. I mean, it's something that my old college tutor. I did history at university, and my old college tutor used to say this, and I remember him telling me fairly recently that 40 years ago, the average student asked, given a week to write an essay about, say, the personal government of George III in the 18th century, could come up with something pretty convincing if he or she was a clever
Right.
person and had the right books. But in that 40 years, the dozen books which you would have consulted in 1980 have multiplied into a couple of hundred books. And so
Right.
even the very greatest historians of the modern age spend years and years refining and refining and refining their books until they let them out into the daylight because there's simply so much stuff out there. There
Right.
is so much information, so much work has been done, so many fields of history have been tilled that even specialists have trouble in formulating their ideas and their opinions about things. And so I'm sure Orwell, it's possible to have pithy opinions about stuff, but they're based on such general and such partial views of the world that I just wonder whether it's possible to have that kind of panoptic vision anymore.
Exactly. I think that's a wonderful point you make. You've written that Orwell was not just a critic of totalitarianism, but also of self-deception.
Mhm.
What lessons does that offer for a world where truth itself seems so very contested today?
There is at bottom is a kind of it's a psychological point, isn't it? I mean, the animals. I'm just writing something about Animal Farm at the moment, so all this is rather kind of current in my head. But it's noticeable that even the most tyrannical of regimes, I mean, even such a specious and fraudulent regime as the one at Animal Farm in Orwell's novels, the people running it are still concerned to get the masses on their side. And so
Right.
whenever they do anything particularly fraudulent or distasteful, they always try to dress it up as being for the common good. And it's never a case of, no one ever turns around and says, "We don't like you. We're going to oppress you. We're going to take your milk. We're going to keep you chained up in these
Of
cages."
course.
Nobody actually says that. It's all pretend. It's all a form of pretense. So there's a very interesting kind of psychological thing going on there as well. The tyrannical regime trying to sort of justify itself, trying to appear to make it look as if it's appearing with a certain amount of probity. And of
Sort of
course,
a
the
deception that
individual,
everyone agrees to play along to.
and it's an individual thing too. I mean, it's very, very interesting working on Animal Farm as I am on the moment to see the kind of knots that the people who didn't want to publish it tied themselves up in when they were trying to explain to Orwell why they didn't want to publish it. I mean, there were several publishers who turned it down on the grounds that it was very unwise to write a novel criticizing Stalin just before the Normandy landings of 1944. When Uncle Joe
Of
was our
course.
great ally, and you read some of their explanations and think, how could they have believed this? How
Right.
could any sort of ordinary minded person actually believe some of the things that they were writing? So it's the self justificatory aspect, I suppose, of all of this that's so fascinating. And I think Orwell was a very acute critic and exposer of that.
I'm looking here at the clock and I realized that, nearly 35 minutes have gone by and I could keep this conversation going forever. Tell us a bit about the book you're working on, your current project, because I think someone would pick up, your latest Orwell biography, which I should have said early on that it was given to me by my wife for Christmas a year or
Mm.
two ago, and I plowed through it recently and absolutely loved it. Thus, this conversation. What is next for you? Tell us
It's
what's
very
on
kind of
your.
you to ask. I always say to myself, you've probably done enough here on Orwell, but then something else comes up and I
Sure.
do it. So, as well as the two biographies, I've written a kind of biography in inverted commas of 1984. And I've
Right.
also written a book called Who is Big Brother, which is a kind of reader's guide to Orwell and goes off on certain kind of tangent. But the book I'm writing at the moment is in a series. There's a publisher here in the UK does a series called Great Events. People, Russian specialists have written about aspects of the Russian Revolution and that
Right.
that kind of thing. And and Animal Farm counts as a great event because of the terrific struggle that Orwell had to get it published in 1944-5, when, as I say, it was turned down by potential sponsor after potential sponsor simply because it was thought to be so inimical to our relationships with the Soviet Union in the
Right.
mid-1940s. And it took, I mean, Orwell finished writing it in February, March 1944, but it wasn't published until after the end of the war in August 1945. Such difficulty did he have, but he managed. And this is the amusing thing to remain quite sort of. Although he was cross about the refusals, he could also be quite funny about it. So, when it was turned down by the firm of Jonathan Cape, again on the grounds that it's anti-Sovietism, Orwell said to his friend Innes Holden, he said, "I've been told that Cape won't publish this because, quote, Stalin wouldn't like it." And he said, "Can you imagine?" He said, "Can you imagine Joe Stalin, who doesn't know a word of any European language, sitting in the Kremlin reading a copy of Animal Farm and holding it up and saying, 'I don't like this'?" I think was very, very funny and shows that, it shows his sense of humor.
Just shifting gears a little bit to the
Mm.
life of a writer. If you go through your bibliography with this wonderful catalog of books about Orwell, but also novels and such,
Mm.
give us a sense, me as somebody who is never more than an aspiring writer. How do you decide what's next? How do you decide when the muse grabs you and you say, there's a novel inside me in the next six
Well,
months or next 12 months, or a novel, or let's dive back into the life of one of the great writers of the 20th century?
I'm in a very lucky position because all my children have grown up. There's, the expense there has mostly gone. So I sit here in my house with my wife, who's also a writer, and it's can't do absolutely what I want to do, but I have a much freer hand than I
Sure.
used to. And I don't have to write as much journalism as I used to do, to support my growing family. And so pretty much if I decide I want to do a particular project, there's usually some way of doing it, which is great. And it does mean that what I do is very kind of heterodox. It goes off in all kinds of different directions, but that's what I like doing. I mean, I've just published a book of short stories here in the UK. I've just finished writing a book about Tolkien, which is going to come out next year on both sides of
And
the Atlantic. I've just written a novel, which is going to come out in 2027, and I'm just working on this Animal Farm book now. So there is a danger, I suppose, of all this extending a bit too widely. And,
well, I
you
think
know,
you figured out a recipe. I think you have
but you
certainly
see,
figured out
that's
a
what I like
recipe.
doing.
And
I mean, I'm not, I don't want to sort of sound sort of Pollyanna-ish about this, but I love being able to do this, and my idea of fun is to go to my desk and start putting words on a screen, I'm afraid.
fantastic. I love it. Well, that's a wonderful way to transition to our last question. And we always
Yeah.
ask our guests to discuss, give us a book or two about their subject. And I think for
Mm.
this one, this is maybe a two-part question. What is, your desert island disc sort of question of what's the one book you would take, the one Orwell book you would take with you that if you had to leave all the rest behind, what means the
Well,
most to you? Is it back to that first one that you read when you were 12 years old, or?
that's such a difficult question. I think what I would do, and I think this anthology probably the book probably does exist, or if not, it could be contrived. If I had to take an Orwell book, what I would like to take is his complete as I please columns. Now, this was an 800-word essay that he wrote on a weekly basis between 1944 and about 1947 for Tribune, which is a left-wing weekly magazine in the UK, and they are completely wonderful. He just wrote whatever he wanted to write about. He wrote that week in 3 or 4 paragraphs, and it can be about the world political situation or the roses he's growing in his back garden, or obscure books that he's read. And there's always something there. In any given 800 words, there's always 3 or 4 things where you think, oh, this is just wonderful. And so I think I would like to take a volume of Orwell's As I Please columns.
And what
Okay.
else in that world of, countless Orwell analyses and such, is there something that stands out beyond your work, of course, which of course we will put in the show notes, but that you have found particularly insightful? Is it a look at Orwell's, like you say, relationships with women, or his time in Burma, or his time at the BBC?
There are so many good books that have been written on particular aspects. For example, there's a wonderful book about by a journalist called Emma Larkin about finding Orwell in Burma. And there's very little to find because this is one of the parts of his life where we know almost nothing because all the records were
Right.
destroyed and no letters are left. But this journalist has simply wandered around Burma, obviously then under an authoritarian regime, drawing parallels between, and going and sort of I was explaining how much the Burmese loved Orwell because they thought that, his book so reflected what was going on in their country. There's that. There's a brilliant, as I was saying earlier, that we knew too little for so long. We knew too little about Eileen, Orwell's first wife, and a woman called Sylvia Top wrote a biography of Eileen 5 years ago,
Right.
which I would thoroughly recommend as providing a kind of pipeline into her extraordinarily vivid personality. So that there's all kinds of stuff out there. It's everywhere one
Whatever
looks.
facet of his life, someone has probably dug into it to the point
Someone
of a
has done
book.
something and done, and people use the other thing that happens is that very gifted writers use Orwell as the excuse or the starting off point for a kind of circular flight around his work and their world. I'm thinking of a book like Rebecca Solnit's Orwell's Roses that came out about 4 years ago, which is, as I say, it's a circular flight. She
Sure.
she flies off from Planet Orwell, flickers around a bit, and then comes back to Planet Orwell. But it's a very entertaining ride.
We'll flag those in the show notes. Well,
Good.
David, thank you so much. Again, we could have carried this conversation on long beyond what your time allows. But thank you for taking the
Well,
time,
thank
and
you.
I certainly wish you the best of luck with your multiple upcoming projects. And
Thank you.
hopefully we can do this again.
It's been great fun. Thanks very much, Todd.